So today I'm going to be cutting and printing my repeat pattern stencil. So to start out with, what I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer my drawing to a piece of Mylar. And so I'm just going to go through and draw those lines carefully with Sharpie. I should probably have taped down my piece of transparency, but I'm just holding it down carefully here. I'm using frosted mylar instead of clear acetate, and I've tried actually both of them, and I found that frosted mylar made it much easier for me to see what I was doing while I cut the stencil. Also, the frosted texture helps a little bit with accidentally over applying ink. It catches a little bit of that ink as we put it in through the stencil. It results in a stencil that looks a little dirty as we go, but it will print fairly well. And so once you get your drawing fully transferred, we'll be ready to cut. This is, by the way, a repeating pattern. So you'll notice that as the drawing slips off one side of the page, it picks up at the other sides. I'm drawing out the border of the image. This will just help me line it up with itself as I'm placing multiple impressions of this on a single page. All right, so first of all, then you want to go ahead and cut. And if you're not comfortable using an X-Acto knife, you just want to make sure that you're pulling away from your hands. It's much better to do a sort of cut that uses your whole arm rather than just the muscles in your hands. You'll get a much smoother cut if you can kind of just drag the tool using all of your arm. And if you're not comfortable cutting with an X-Acto knife, maybe take a scrap of Mylar and do some practice marks. It can be a little fatiguing after a while, so take breaks. And then you can also, for really tight turns, you can kind of rotate the stencil underneath your hands to get a much more smooth, tight turn, and trying to turn your arm, right? So you'll notice on the screen the stencil keeps changing position. That's to give myself a better curve of my hand to cut those curves. So slow and steady. As you're drawing out your stencil, you really want to think about how the structure of your drawing is going to hold together the stencil, right? So I can't just cut out everything here and have it kind of hold together. So I've specifically made my drawing in such a way that it touches itself in many places. And what that does is it creates a sort of framework to hold the stencil together, which means that at the end of this particular drawing makes for a very sturdy, kind of durable stencil. Just keep at it. Yeah, these are the tight little circles. And I'm actually going to cut this particular drawing into two stencils. So I want to have the little dots on the paper towels and the lines, but I felt like it was going to be too much cutting on the same stencil that I felt like I risked the integrity of the stencil. So I'm actually going to draw it out twice. And so what that actually does is allows me the possibility of printing this stencil in two different colors, which I thought would be really great, right? So, but you'll notice here is that I don't actually have to draw all of the lines, right? I'm not interested in outlining my shapes. I'm interested in capturing the information that isn't indicated in the first stencil. And so I don't need to draw the full circumference of the toilet paper roll. I just need to draw the part that doesn't touch the background, right? Also, I don't need to draw the circumference of the interior toilet paper rolls because that's already cut in the first stencil. The other thing that I'm doing here with this stencil, other than suffering about these teeny tiny little dots that I'm cutting, is that the lines don't actually connect continuously. So in order to make a stencil that has better integrity, I'm actually divided my long lines into several shorter cuts, right? So it's a sort of a long form dotted line. And I thought about areas where I could break up the cut in such a way that it would make more sense in cutting the stencil. So here, this long cut here is actually divided into 3 cuts, right? And it's not each line is not actually a single cut. I'm actually carving each line twice to remove a sliver of material. So it's not just a single cut that I'm going to try and get ink under somehow. It's actually a shape, a sort of like long pointed line. And what's really nice about that is it forces you to consider your line weight, right? So when you're drawing with a marker or whatever, you're like, oh, I'll just make a mark. It's Sharpie width. But when you're cutting the stencil and you have to cut each side of your line, every single cut is a consideration of the line weight. Also, when you go in with those little dots here, I'm actually cutting the dots as if they were little almond shapes, sort of like pointed almonds. And that's just making my life a lot easier for cutting this. I'm also not using an X-Acto knife. I know most people probably have X-Acto knives, but that's not my favorite tool for this job. I'm using what's called an Alpha knife. This is the #1 tool recommended by my bookbinding teacher, and I love it. It has snap-off blades, so when the blade gets dull, I could just kind of take the tip and snap it off and have a new fresh blade. So I did that a couple times in this project because cutting Mylar is actually harder than cutting paper, if you're familiar with cutting paper. So just continuing on with that cut. I'm excited about this as a possibility for giving me 2 different colors. And I think this will still translate well with the 2 colors. Although with my particular demo, I try printing it using 2 different versions of the same ink, just to sort of get a light gray for these dots and a dark black for the background. And in retrospect, I think they're a little bit too subtle of a difference. I'm going to try printing this again using wash and bright colors so I can get more contrast between the 2 different separations. Last thing is that while I'm cutting these, I've decided that these lines that I've cut are a little bit too narrow. So when I go in with the actual applying and painting out the stencil stuff, I felt like it gave me a bit of a hard time trying to get ink through these really narrow lines. They definitely work, but you have to take a little bit more time applying the ink to get them through. I also wanted to add for my screen print folk who are watching this video, is that cutting a stencil actually is a really good way to block things in your mesh. So I could take these stencils that I'm cutting today and I can actually screen print with them, or I can apply ink with the pochoir method. So here I am going in with the brush and I am brushing away from the stencil. So I'm pulling the ink towards the light area in the middle away from that stencil, as I don't want any of the ink to get swept underneath it. And I'm actually really careful to use a fairly dry brush. This ink is pretty opaque, but I don't want to go in with a really juicy brush. Otherwise, that ink will pool underneath my stencil and cause I will lose a bit of that crispness of my line. I'm just basically using a thin amount of India ink here. I just wanted to see how that would play. For registration, I'm just eyeballing it with the transparency of the registration to tell me where the 2 edges should line up. And because this is a repeating pattern, I'm kind of noticing where there are some spots where my cut isn't exactly perfect. So when I notice that the 2 edges don't exactly line up, I can go back to my stencil and make some changes to get that stencil to line up a little better. Mainly this sort of top-down line there on the right. That one is a little bit larger on one side than the other. So as far as which inks you could use to go through this technique, this is called pochoir, where we're basically applying ink through the stencil. Other techniques that you could use to print this out is you could use, I'm going to try gouache. I feel like gouache might give us a good opacity for our bang for our buck. You could use India ink. You could use watercolor, although I think watercolor would be really subtle. So you might need to use like a more concentrated watercolor if you want a little bit more punch. Also, if you're thinking about building up layers here, so I could go in with more than one color. I could have transparencies that overlap each other. Here they distinctly don't overlap. And also it's a good idea to tape it down. You see how it moved a little bit? So just be careful about your stencil moving. I'm a little freewheeling, kind of placing it as I go. But I don't have an image that requires super strict registration. Even if it's a little bit off, it still makes sense. So with this one, I've actually watered down the same indie ink because my goal here was to get like a light gray. The problem is that I think that I'm losing, because I'm not getting very much ink going through my stencil here, the light gray is a little bit more subtle than I think I want. So in order to revisit this, I'm going to try printing it with a different color, just to get that contrast between the two different stencils. If you go through the trouble to cut two stencils, you might as well print them two different colors, just as a premise. If you're unfamiliar with screen printing your stencils, which is not what I'm doing here in this video, but for my screen printers, you can actually take the stencil and just stick it to the underside of your screen. And even with just like a veil of ink, will hold it in place. And so what that does is it acts like your emulsion stencil and just blocks the ink from traveling through at those spots that haven't been cut. In the areas where you've cut openings, the ink can travel through. And I could actually print an edition of these stencils with my screen if I had that at the ready. So for those of you who do have your screen at home and you're curious about giving that a try, I think go for it. Just make sure you have a good place to kind of clean up your screen print ink and squeegee and stuff. So I'm going to continue applying ink to this stencil. I felt with these really skinny lines, I really had to work in ink a little bit more. I kind of have to just keep at it just to make sure enough of it is going through the stencil. The other thing is that I had a little bit more trouble with pooling on this because of that overworking. I had a little bit more of the ink pool underneath the lines here and create, it still translates just fine, but just be careful that you don't want ink to be too wet, right? So I had a little bit too much liquid on my brush and it pooled a little bit underneath that line. So you really, even if you're trying to apply more, you still want to go in with that dry brush. And there it is. Looking good. Thank you.